you who are here for the first time, I think that's just really Jeff, right? Have you been here recently?
Recently.
Yeah, no.
Just to the degree.
Exactly. We're taking kind of a sub-study right now of systematic theology. You can tell by the first page of the outline where we've been. We've studied quite a bit thus far, especially as it pertains to theology proper. And today we'll continue with that study. We'll wrap up our study of theology proper, and then we'll get into a little bit of Christology as well. So, if you have any questions at any time, don't be afraid to raise your hand. This is kind of a discussion-based class. We like all the discussion we can muster, because if you don't ask the questions, then you can't possibly understand what you don't understand otherwise. So just please ask the questions. We've got a lot of people here who, if I don't know the answer, they'll know the answer. So let's just keep the discussion open. We're actually at the point where we're going to look at the names of God. I've saved this for the last simply because I believe it's one of those things that is not as important as the other parts that we've been discussing, but it is important to know the names of God, especially if you're going to engage in a study of the Hebrew. If you're going to understand even some of the parts of the New Testament with relation to who God is, it's important that we understand the Jewish designations for God as they are brought to us in the Old Testament. Now, there are basically three designations for God in the Old Testament. There's Elohim, Adonai, and Yahweh. At least I think that's the way we say it. Nobody really knows for sure. We'll discuss more about that in just a little bit. There are other names used for God as well, but these are usually compound names that take the name Elohim or Adonai or Yahweh and add something either at the beginning or at the end of it. We'll talk about a few of those, but they are really just intensifiers or modifiers to express a different avenue or different aspect of how we can view God. Again, we'll talk about that more in just a minute. Let's talk about this word Elohim, though. Elohim, and you may think I'm being funny when I say it that way, but the H in the Hebrew language is always pronounced, it's got a hard guttural sound, so it's not Elohim. I mean, that you could say it that way, but I'm a person who believes in, to the best of my ability, respecting the languages of other people. I believe that we should seek to try to pronounce their words the way they pronounce them, and so I think Elohim is the appropriate pronunciation for us. Now, what does Elohim mean?
Gods.
Gods, okay. Not possessive, but plural. Plural. Get the word El, which means what? Not in Spanish. Doesn't mean the. What does El mean?
God.
Okay, it is translated as God, but what does it actually mean? El actually means strong, or the one with strength. It's an indicator of the one who has strength. It's translated as God because in the Hebrew mind there was only one who had maximum strength, and that was God. In the earliest days of monotheism, we think that the first monotheist in the region in which Abraham found himself was actually Abraham's father. He had gotten this idea, I suppose, by divine revelation somehow. We're just not told. But Abraham's father, who was who? You may remember who Abraham's father was?
I want to say Nahor, but
Abraham's father was historically viewed by most theologians as the first monotheist. He's the one who probably introduced that concept to Abraham. But he actually referred to God as Ha Elohim. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. That's another one of those modifiers that's very important for us to understand when we talk about God in this way. Now, we know that Elohim is a plural. Why is that important? Why is it important that Elohim is a plural?
It's Trinitarian.
Because it's Trinitarian. Plurality is where we get our Trinitarian doctrine from. It's this idea of plurality. Now, there are a lot of theologians out there, a lot of scholars out there, mainly liberal scholars, who believe that when we see Elohim, and which is translated in different places, for example, Genesis 1:26, we read that God said, "Let us make man in our own image." And a lot of liberal theologians try to dismiss the plurality idea by saying that what's used there is called the plural of majesty. We see the plural of majesty used in a lot of medieval writings. You know, you'll see a king standing giving a speech, and he'll say something like, "Let us go to such and such a place and do such and such a thing." He's talking to a bunch of serfs and peasants. He's not talking about them. He's not using us in a plural term. He's using us as a way of magnifying His majesty. You'll see this in a lot of medieval writings. Again, you'll see kings and queens and monarchs saying,
we are not amused.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we are not amused. Our patience is running thin. Things like that. That's the plural of majesty. And there are a lot of theologians, a lot of biblical scholars, liberal scholars who are saying that when we read, "Let us make man in our own image," it was simply God using the plural of majesty. Well, that's just not true. Why?
Because that didn't even come about until, about that time, about the medieval time or something.
Yes. That is strictly a medieval type thing. Or at least dark ages to the medieval period, to the Renaissance period. This is not an ancient Eastern thing. They would not have used the plural of majesty. If you read your Bibles, there are examples where we have monarchs saying things. And these statements are brought down to us in our English language, directly derived from the Hebrew language, and we get a feel for exactly what's being said there. Genesis 41:15, Pharaoh, for example, says, "I have dreamed a dream." He doesn't say, "We have dreamed a dream," right? He says, "I have dreamed a dream." Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2:3 said, "I have dreamed." He doesn't say, "We have dreamed." He could have said that if he had been alive during the Middle Ages, but he didn't. Darius the Mede in Daniel 6:26 says, "I make a decree." Cyrus in Ezra 5:8 said, "The Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth." He doesn't say us. So there are really countless examples of where we can dismiss the idea of the plural of majesty simply because it's just not used. It's just not used. So when we read in Genesis 1:26, "Let us make man in our own image," what we see there is a Trinitarian statement. A Trinitarian statement. Now, we need to understand that this little suffix here, "im," indicates plurality, just for your own knowledge. There's another group spoken of in the Bible that ends with that. Anybody know what that is?
I said you were gods or something like that, or
Okay.
angels. You obeyed them a little lower than the heavenly beings.
Seraphim. Cherubim.
Angels, yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought there was a talking about Elohim.
Seraphim. Okay.
Cherubim,
Cherubim.
Sepharvaim. I mean, there's like a bunch of.
Exactly. There's the Nephilim.
Yeah.
Who those cats were, I have no idea, but they were
Those
scary.
giants?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were giants. I don't know if that's just because everybody back then was short and here comes these tall guys. I don't think so. But yeah, you can tell. These talk about groups of people. Elohim is the strong one, God, in plural. So there's pretty definitive proof that we're not talking about the plural of majesty. We're talking about the plural in terms of numbers here. Now, the word, again, Elohim. Let me get my eraser. the word Elohim can be combined with other things. When we read, for example, that Terah passed down to Abraham the principle of Ha Elohim, what does that mean? Whenever something is modified in Hebrew like this, it means the one, the true one, the one true God, plural. The one true God who exists in a plurality. So really, a lot of people would say, and that's what got most conservative scholars convinced that the plural of majesty was not being used, because the designation for the one true God is Ha Elohim, which means He's the one true God, but He exists in a plurality. Very important that you understand that. This was reflected in the Jewish call to worship, the Shema. You recall they blow the shofar, and as they gather the people in for worship, they recite the Shema. The Shema says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." And what word do they use there? Elohim. The Lord our God is one God, but He exists in three persons. So, is there any questions about that?
In the Hebrew, that the Ha,
Yeah.
that that's symbolized by, it's just a mark, right? It's
Yes.
not,
It would.
it's a mark in front of a word that that makes it Ha.
Uh-huh.
So I guess there's a lot of I guess people who say, well, the mark is there sometimes it's not, and it can be a flaw in the paper, you know.
Yeah, but it's a pretty distinctive mark.
All right.
I mean, it's something, I don't know what it is, but I mean, it's something like that. It's not.
Okay.
It's not like that.
Okay.
It's not a jot or a tittle. Let's put it that way.
Right.
It's an actual word that modifies Elohim. So again, I don't know if that's it, or 9 times or 99 to 100 is not. But again, it's a very distinct thing, and it's used to express this idea that God is one God, because after all, the Hebrews grew up in a pluralistic society in which there were many gods. They grew up in a region of the world where it was not unusual to worship a pantheon of gods. Pantheons didn't begin with the Greeks and Romans. Pantheons of gods were around for centuries. I mean, when the one true God does not divulge Himself to a people, what do the people do?
Yeah, they create their own gods.
Yeah.
And St. Augustine treats this too. He talks about historically how all the early pantheon of gods were really just great men who excelled,
Yeah.
and who after their death were elevated to God, and then eventually those same people morphed into Jupiter and Mars. And
Exactly. If we were still of that mindset today, Spurgeon would be a god.
Right.
The great god Spurgeon, the Wesley brothers would be gods. I mean, because they were such profound figures in the history of mankind, they would have been elevated to that position, just like Jim said. I mean, and then you'd have this whole pantheon of gods. You might have one that's the god, but doubtful. They believed that thunderstorms and things like that were the gods wrestling for power amongst things like that. So, the designation Ha Elohim was meant to point out we worship the one true God, which was divinely delivered to them. That knowledge was divinely delivered and imparted to them, because otherwise they would not have. That goes against man's nature to have one solitary God, but He has revealed Himself in His Word. Okay, what's the next one? Adonai. Adonai. The designation Adonai generally means Lord or Master. Lord or Master. It's usually translated Lord in our English Bibles. It occurs some 449 times in the Old Testament, and it's 350 times of those It's used in conjunction with Yahweh. It's used in conjunction with Yahweh. It's used really to denote that master-servant relationship. In other words, if there was a word to describe how man is configured in his relation to God, the word Adonai would be used to remind him that God is master, man is servant. God is Lord, man is subject. So it was used to describe that relationship between God and man. It was also used to point to God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty was pointed to in this word. Adonai is probably better translated as Lord of all or Lord over all. That's just how powerful the word was. Lord over all or master over all. Now you can see already the different designations for God. Elohim, did that not mean master? Well, of course it did, but it was not understood as being that. We have different words that we call different, or that we call the same thing. But we use different words to put a little shade of meaning on it. For example, what's a good word?
Professor, teacher.
Yeah. Professor, teacher, maestro, conductor, dad versus father,
pastor, minister,
pastor, shepherd,
Rabbi, teacher.
Yeah. So there are all different ways that we use the same principles, using entirely different words to describe the same thing. This is the same thing. Elohim describes God in his oneness and yet plurality. Adonai refers to him in his relationship to all that he has created as the master of it all. Then we come to Yahweh. Yahweh. It's actually derived from 4 letters in the Hebrew. These 4 letters, just in case you want to impress your friends, are known as the Tetragrammaton. The Tetragrammaton. What does that mean? It's a fancy way of saying 4 letters. 4 letters that mean something but have the vowels removed. Okay, the vowel will go here, here, and here. Right? This is why we really don't know if Yahweh is Yahweh. Yahweh might be Yahweh, might be Yahweh, it might be Yiwi, it might be Yitwi, it might be Yahweh, it might be, who knows? I don't know why they decided on Yahweh.
They took the vowels from Adonai and they interspersed them in there.
Okay, good. He's not an Adonai.
No, but in the Hebrews, because you're using Greek style letters or whatever, but
yeah,
what they did was because they took the units, and they took the vowels from Adonai and placed them into Yahweh to get the name.
Okay.
Not in English, but in Hebrew.
Exactly. Even then, in doing that, they didn't know what it was.
Right.
You know,
because that was done in like 1000 AD.
Right. Why would they do this though? Why would they write that way? Why not just tell us what it is? Why not just show us through some written form what it is?
They didn't want to say it. They didn't want to write it.
You can't utter it. You can't write it. If you'll notice in a lot of Jewish writings today, even among the Messianic Jews, which is really silly, I think, among the Messianic Jews, they're just carrying over one more thing that they always, they're always trying to carry something over that's Jewish just to prove that they're part of the team. But you'll see them writing God like that. They will not write the name God because they think it's an affront to a holy God for a mere mortal to write his name.
Well, our English translators kind of did a similar thing.
Yeah.
By just capitalizing all the letters for the word.
Yeah.
So we've kind of done the same thing. We just
we show our respect in different ways.
Right.
Yeah.
I was part of a church that when they would read the Bible, every time they saw the capital letter L-O-R-D, they would say Yahweh.
Oh, yeah.
And it changes the reading. It's very interesting.
Right.
Because it does change the way you read the Bible when you make that substitution. You put the personal name instead of our designator.
Right, right. Well, and we've also taken the name Yahweh and we've transliterated it into English.
Yeah.
Jehovah is a direct transliteration of Yahweh.
Well, that was because of Latin. In Latin,
of course, yeah. But we did transliterate. It's an English word.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Latins were the first to do it, but we adopted it. Jehovah. There's the Y. There's the H. There's the W. There's the other H. You might ask why that's a Y and we say it as a J.
When you look at the 1611, they didn't actually even use the letter J.
Right.
Yeah, there wasn't even a letter that was used for a long, long time.
Yep. So we've just, that's the transliteration part. We've just made it Jehovah. So anytime you see Jehovah in the scriptures, you can actually translate that as Yahweh. Now there's a lot of modifications to Jehovah that we see in scripture. A lot of times, for example, when Abraham was spared his son, what did he say? What did he call that place?
Was that Jehovah Jireh?
Yeah, Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. Okay. We also have Jehovah Tzidkenu, which is what?
The Lord our righteousness.
The Lord our righteousness. There are all kinds of things like that where Jehovah is modified to express something about Him. So in these cases, it's just simply Yahweh, our provider, and Yahweh, our righteousness, and so on and so forth. Different modifications to point to something else that God has done for us. In a phrase. So, any questions about that? Those three names for God. No? Okay. Let's move on to God's works of creation and providence. Creation. When God created, how did He do so?
Ex nihilo.
He did so ex nihilo. Yep. Ex, out of, nihilo, nothing. So the doctrine says, if God created everything, which is creatio ex nihilo, if God created everything from nothing, then everything that is came from nothing. Why is that important? Who cares that God created ex nihilo?
Because then that puts nothing outside of God's sovereignty.
Matter is not eternal. Matter is not eternal. God created everything that is from nothing. It was His own creative power that caused everything that is to come into being. Vincent, you know you and I are the same age. We are. You're the same age as I am.
I'm only 10.
No. You know how old you are? You're as old as creation. What do I mean by that?
Like I'm like 1,000 years old.
You're a lot older than that. I don't know how old the universe is. Some people say between 6,000 and 10,000 years. But you're as old as creation itself. How's that possible?
because he thought of creating you at that moment.
Well, actually, his atoms, his atomic structure has always been. There's no new matter ever created.
All the stuff that he's made of is as old as creation. God is not in the business of creating. He created once, everything that is, and all the rest of us are just byproducts of that single act of creation. So really, everything that makes us up is as old as creation itself. Really, really interesting concept. Now, given the second law of thermodynamics, what's called entropy, we all go from a state of order to a state of chaos. If you don't believe it, whether you're about 55, 60 years old. Yeah, it's not quite that long.
Amen.
But, that's how come, the baby comes out and his whole body's as smooth as a baby's bottom. I guess that's appropriate to say. And then by the time you get old, it's all weathered and worn and beaten. And before long, after you're put in the ground, after years and years, it goes back to the dust. And then another person that's made from creation comes along and marries another bit of creation, and they have another little baby, and on it goes. On and on it goes. So we're as old as creation itself. Very important that we understand that matter is not eternal. God created it all, and we're part of that creation. Now, there are those who believe in what's called the gap theory when it comes to God's creation. They say, well, the creation cannot be as young as most Christians say it is, between 6,000 and 10,000 years. So they try to get God out of a fix, so to speak, by saying, well, there must be this thing called the gap theory. And the gap theory is actually based on Genesis 1:2. In Genesis 1:2, we read the earth was formless and void. And they say that the word was there should be translated as became. In the beginning, the earth became formless and void. This allows the idea that the matter was already there and God just reconfigured it into something that was not without form and void. That's really so much nonsense. There's nothing that would indicate at all that there was a gap between when God made all the matter and when He actually formed it into the universe in which we live today. There's nothing that would suggest that. There's nothing that needs to suggest that. Now, I realize scientists in their ultimate wisdom have used carbon-14 dating, and they've used light years, and they've used all these other devices to try to explain the old age of the universe. They'll say, for example, well, if the nearest star to us, Alpha Centauri, if we can see its light, we know that it's how many light years away?
About 6.
Yeah, about 6 light years, 6 to 8, 6, 7 light years away. If we can see that light, we know that it takes light at least 6 years to travel from there to here, and so we can judge that, at least the universe is 6 years old. But let's go out way out into the outer reaches of the universe. We've got stars that are trillions of light years away. Ergo, since we can detect them, their light took that long to reach us, we can assume that the Earth is at least, or the universe is at least however many trillion years old. And on it goes. And that would be a good, in the human mind, that's a good, hypothesis. I mean, you've got the planet, or the, whatever, you've got the Earth here, and you've got a star out here, and it's a trillion light years away, let's say, and that means the light took a trillion years to get here. This is the farthest one, let's say. Okay, the universe is a trillion years old. How does the Christian circumvent that, though? How do we argue against that? When it comes to God's creation, when it comes to the young earth theory, how do we argue against that? I mean, it's pretty ironclad if you look at it that way. Light travels at a set speed. It took that long to get here. That means the universe obviously has to be at least that old. Not so. Not so. That's really what happens when man looks at things from his own perspective.
Right.
If we look at it from God's perspective, when God created Adam, formed him from the dust of the earth, and breathed life into him, into his nostrils, was Adam a baby? fully grown. He was fully grown. When God inhabited the earth with trees and plants and creepy crawly things, in what state did He create them? In their mature state, in their fully grown state. So doesn't it also stand to reason that when God put the stars in the heavens and formed this universe, that He also formed it with the light already here? Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. What scientists do is akin to shooting an arrow in that wall over there, and then walking over to the wall and drawing this around where the arrow went in. See how good a shot I am? I hit a bullseye. No, you created a bullseye after the fact. That's what man is attempting to do. And so, it's perfectly reasonable to me, and should be to all believers in a supernatural God who's able to do whatever He does, and has proven that He puts things here in a mature state. It just stands to reason that He would have done all of it at once. And there you go. People say, well, what about the Big Bang? Well, I'm sure that when He created it, there was a Big Bang.
It's a funny show.
When He said, let there be whatever, I'm sure it was a fairly disruptive thing.
Sound is part of His creation.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Lightning's pretty loud.
Lightning is pretty loud, but that's probably not nearly as loud as the Big Bang might have been. If there was a Big Bang, I don't ascribe to the Big Bang theory like scientists do. Scientists say that, believe this, scientists say that everything in the universe, all the matter that you see, this church, this city, this state, this country, this earth, everything in the universe, Vincent, was at one time encapsulated in something that big.
You just add water and it grows.
No, supposedly it reached what they call critical mass,
Right.
which means it can't be compressed anymore, which causes a violent chain reaction atomically, and then all of a sudden, bang, everything starts spreading out in all different directions.
Yeah, it has to be that small for enough energy to shoot things out light years away and stuff.
Exactly.
It's insanity, really.
Yeah. What takes more faith to believe?
Right.
That God created it all? Or that everything... You couldn't even get all your toys into a space that
And I
way.
say, yeah, a little dot that weighs everything that the universe weighs, yeah.
Right. You can't put everything in your house in a spot that big.
Suspended on nothing.
Right.
The toys would be standing on it.
That's the argument that you use whenever we're accused of being unreasonable. It's a silly argument.
Yeah.
You say, well, it's only silly if you don't have the presupposition that God exists.
Right.
Exactly.
If you believe in a God who created the heavens and the earth, it's not a silly, it's a very reasonable argument. If you believe in a God who created, as you said, Adam and Eve aged, it's not a silly argument. So
Right.
let's talk about a silly argument.
Yeah, here's a silly argument.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good point, because if you presuppose there's not a God, then you have to come up with something
Right.
like that.
So you have to come up with that, but then there's even presuppositions within that. One, that light speed is constant over time and space. That matter came from that small. I mean, you have to make several presuppositions there too, and pointing those out to people is, it opens people's eyes to say, okay, I do make presuppositions.
I don't know if you've heard or not, and I find this absolutely hilarious, only because I'm not a scientist and I don't believe in a lot of what science says. But how many of you have been following what's going on with the CERN atom smasher,
Is that the thing that they think they found something that travels faster?
the
than
God
light?
particle?
Faster than,
They were looking for the God particle, so to speak. Yeah, it's that one little quark that explains how everything came into existence. They call it the God particle. Isn't that funny how they call it the God particle?
Yeah.
But they have determined, and they're opening up their research for everybody to look at, but they've determined that Einstein was wrong,
Right.
that the speed of light can actually be superseded.
Wow.
What does that do to physics?
Yeah.
Destroys it.
Changes all the formula.
Mm-hmm.
Especially quantum physics. It destroys every bit of their hypotheses thus far. Because if you've got something that's faster than the speed of light, then you've got all new calculations to make. And, yeah.
And all new funding to receive.
And all new funding to receive.
There you go.
There you go.
And all of our money.
Now, what about the 6 days? When God created, He created everything in 6 days. And there are a lot of people that say, well, that's just not possible. Well, of course it's not possible for you. I suspect that's why a lot of people have heartburn with the issue of the creation that happened in 6 days, because they themselves could not create all that is in 6 days. Well, okay, it's okay along those lines to not agree that it's possible to do it in 6 days. But again, we have to think from God's perspective. And when God created, He created everything. And I say He could have created it all in 1 nanosecond or quicker.
Yeah,
but He decided, yeah, He could have snapped His proverbial fingers and everything would have been in place. But He chose 6 days. I think to give us some sense of His order, His structure, and His reasoning, and His rationale. It's more of His condescension to us that He did things in an orderly fashion. He also did it to set up the Sabbath, which was a day that would be reserved specifically in recognition of what He had done, and our resting from our labors just as He rested from His labors. So we believe as Christians that God created everything in a literal 6-day period. Now there are some Christians who do not believe that God created everything in a literal 6 days. Charles Hodge, for example, didn't believe that everything was created in a literal 6 days. You might be surprised to understand that B.B. Warfield did not think that everything was created in a period of 6 literal days. He assumed that those 6 literal days really denoted certain eras or certain epochs of time where God took 6 categories of time and used those to create things. Again, they surmise all this, I think, largely because they don't really understand how they themselves could pull this off. I'm not accusing B.B. Warfield or Charles Hodge of any of that, but there's got to be a reason why they believe that. Yeah.
I think it stems from the apparent proof that science has come up with. It's a science says the Earth has to be billions of years old.
Yeah.
So, and they seem to have proof for that.
Right.
So now we're kind of saying, okay, now let's look at this and suppose they're correct. We need to have an answer for it from the Bible,
Yep.
explaining why it's that old.
Exactly.
So when you take away the support for the science, for the Earth is billions of years old, then it seems more reasonable to just believe what it says.
Exactly. Exactly.
So it's not that convincing an argument, and I think Christians are intimidated by the scientific argument. One, because we don't know the science behind it, and two, we see that and we go, well, we believe God, so if science has shown this, then we need to be able to say why God.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, and another thing too, you got to realize where B.B. Warfield blew up. Where he grew up. When did B.B. Warfield grow up? He grew up really during the Age of Enlightenment. He grew up during the modern age. We've talked about those ages before. Those philosophical ages. You have pre-modernity, where man believed in the Bible and he believed in God and he took everything hook, line, and sinker on the basis of faith. We then had the modern period where the Age of Enlightenment came in, the Industrial Age, the Scientific Age came in, and everybody saw that as the answer to all their problems. And B.B. Warfield was probably caught up in that. He was probably part of that Age of Enlightenment who said, this is interesting. Back then, Jim, you know this as well, being a student of church history, back then you had a lot of people who dabbled in what's called natural theology. In other words, they began to look at nature around them in botany and chemistry and all these areas, and they began using science as the litmus test to prove what they had always believed about Scripture. You can't get there from here, and it causes the train to really fly off the tracks. So.
Yeah, because the Bible's not a book about botany.
Right. The Bible's not a science book.
Right.
Although it does have a lot of good science.
It's scientifically correct.
Yes.
But it's not meant to teach science.
Exactly. Yeah, we've talked about, the Solomon's Sea, which was a laver filled with water, and he had these little toy ships in it, I guess, and he could, it was just a representation of his might and his power, Solomon's Sea, the Bible tells us that what was it? Pi is equal to the radius squared.
Yeah.
So what it tells us is that that calculation came out to 3, right? I mean, you can read that in the Bible. I forget where it's at, but it tells us that the measurement came out to 3, whatever. Really, it tells us that the Bible knew what pi was long before. I mean, they rounded it down to 3. We all know that pi is actually 3.159, whatever. So the Bible was correct in identifying pi long before pi was ever discovered by man. We also think of the hydrological cycle, which was not really discovered until the end of the 17th century or thereabouts, where water comes from the heavens, does its thing, returns to the heavens. Well, that's Isaiah. Isaiah said that, you know.
As the sparks fly upward.
Yeah, there's a lot
You
of,
know why they do.
yeah, there's a lot of cool things in the Bible that corroborate what was discovered much, much later. But anyway, getting back to the creation, how do we know that it was 6 literal days?
Because it tells us in the Bible.
There you go.
That's good. A little deeper though.
Well, you have the Yom being rise of the there was sunrise and sunset.
Very good.
So you know whatever the length of the day was, whether it was 24 hours or shorter or longer, it was sunrise to sunset.
Okay. Yom, which is the Hebrew designation for day, was the time calculated between when the sun rose and when the sun set. And even the Bible tells us that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It tells us that the day and the evening, or the evening and the morning, constituted one day. Right? That's further proof that creation took place in 6 literal days. The real proof, though, comes hermeneutically. Hermeneutically, whenever you see the designation Yom modified by an ordinal or cardinal number, 1, 2, 3, 1.5, whenever you see it preceded by that, it's always literal. There are no exceptions to that. Theologians have looked high and low to try to find an exception to that. There are no exceptions. When the book of Genesis was written, it's not written symbolically. It's not written cryptically. It's not like the book of Revelation. It's kind of interesting that the book of Revelation has a lot of symbolism in it and a lot of that sort of thing. But the book of Genesis was not written in that way. And theologians deduce from that wherever Yom is modified by a cardinal or ordinal number, it is always literal. And so when, it's like Vincent said, you know, when the Bible says God created everything in 6 days, He created everything in 6 days. You know, we can try to explain that away, but there's really no need to.
But not only that, Pastor, but you know this, but in Exodus 20, when Moses recounts the creation story and compares it to what we're to do. So for a day-age person that says, well, the days meant ages, well, what the Israelites didn't see it, they didn't see it as an age.
Nope.
So are we supposed to labor for 6 ages and then rest for an age? It's
Good
the same
point.
word.
Good point.
It's the same word and the same usage. So,
Yep.
you know, if you're going to make that leap there, then you have to make that leap.
Well, and they actually had a designation for those instances. They would have what's called a Sabbath year, which means that they'd let their crops lay fallow. They would not do certain things for an entire year. But they designated it as such. It was a Sabbath year. In other words, you'd go 6 years, and on the 7th year, you would rest. So everything was modified. Again, nowhere do we see in Scripture where they had a misunderstanding of that. They knew perfectly well. Why was the Sabbath set up, like John said, why was it set up to occur every 7th day? Because that's what they understood. So, very, very interesting. What about providence? Providence. Not only did God create everything, He provides for everything. And this is the miracle of miracles. Again, there was a cover piece on Time magazine, I believe, back in the 60s. And back in the 60s, somebody declared that God was dead. And they declared that he was dead on the basis of what's called, what? What's the theology that says God wound everything up?
Oh, deism.
And then let it run down. It's deism. There are people who believe that God at one time was active in creation. He created everything and then he walked away from it. I guess to go to other parts of the universe and create things there as well. I really don't understand that. I think it's just man's knee-jerk reaction to all the bad things that happen in the world. You know, how could a loving God still be in control of everything? He must have just wound it all up and then walked away to let it tick down to oblivion. We don't believe that. We believe that God is actively, providentially serving the entire world. And that's really undeniable. According to the Westminster Confession of Faith, which closely mirrors our own confession, it says, God, the creator of all things, doth uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures, actions, and things, from the greatest to the least, by his most wise and holy providence, according to his infallible foreknowledge and the free and immutable counsel of his own will, to the praise of the glory of his wisdom, power, justice, goodness, and mercy. Now, God's providence can be divided into two categories. Two categories. Ordinary and special. What would we place in each of these categories? What's in the ordinary category?
Rain.
Okay. Rain.
I don't know, it was special this week.
Air. Water.
Dirt. Ground.
Food. Dirt.
Juice.
Okay. Food. Yeah. Juice is obviously from God.
Procreation.
Okay. Procreation. What else?
Clouds.
Okay. Which probably fit up here. Clouds, air and rain, water. What else? What else do we
Light
see?
and dark. Rest.
Yeah. Light, dark, breath, heartbeat, blood, whatever. The list goes on and on as far as ordinary providences goes. I mean, we're told repeatedly in Scripture that God causes the rain to fall on the field of the just and the unjust. You know, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're standing out in the middle of the field and it begins to rain, God's going to rain on you. That's an act of his ordinary providence.
Is that the same thing as common grace? Or is that
Yeah, common grace is another way of looking at it. Common grace would fall more into the sustenance arena, you know. I mean, just because God provides procreation, for example, doesn't mean everybody's going to procreate. People might not procreate. Common grace, though, would encapsulate those things that kind of between ordinary and special, but that we all enjoy. It's a good statement. We all enjoy those things. One of the best renderings of Romans 8:28, you all remember that? God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him, for those who are called according to his purpose. But really the way that's supposed to be understood is in all things. That means his general providence. God works for good, for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose, which is his special providence. Okay, so his special providence would include salvation. Even before that, his election was provided before that. Election, salvation, the blessings that we as Christians enjoy, every blessing, spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Ephesians, everything that's specifically Christian. Righteousness, holiness, revelation, ears to hear, graciousness. Yeah, all of that would fall right in line with God's special providence. We're not really going to talk about his special providence today. I want to reserve that for when we talk about soteriology, which is the doctrine of salvation. Because it's at the point of salvation that God's special providences really come into sharper focus for the believer. So, Anyway, just remember everything that happens as a result of God's divine providence. Some time ago I read something that R.C. Sproul had actually developed that shows how providence works, and I think it's something we should consider more than we do. I think a lot of times we see our lives as just a series of random events that happen for no reason. When the bad things happen, we tend to wonder what's going on and what's happening and why am I in this pickle and why did I get in this mess and so on and so forth. But it's healthy sometimes to look back and really look at God's providence as a positive thing throughout, regardless of whether you go through those hard times or whether you're enjoying those good times. God's providence is something that serves us throughout our existence and beyond. Let me just read this to you. I've read it before during church. Some of you may have not heard this, though. It's about Joseph and his multicolored coat. Jacob, of course, made Joseph this multicolored coat. His brothers were extremely jealous after his receiving this coat. He was actually the pet child of the family. And if not for the intervention of Joseph's brother, Reuben, and certainly the providence of God, Joseph would have been killed on the spot. They were that angry with him. Instead, the brothers hatched a plan. They would actually take him out and they're going to bury him in a hole, you'll recall, and put blood all over a piece of his clothing and make his father think that a tiger had come and got him. What they did, though, they sold him to a caravan of Midianite camel traders. You know that when he got to where he was finally sold, he ended up in Potiphar's house. Potiphar was a really high-ranking official in the Egyptian government. That whole thing happened with Potiphar's wife. Joseph lived through that, and then he interpreted the dreams of, you know, the butler and the baker. He found favor with Pharaoh after interpreting one of his dreams as well. He was rewarded with being elevated to the position of vice-regent of all of Egypt. He was put in a very high position. It just happened to be during the famine of the land, when Joseph's brothers actually came to Egypt to beg for grain. And who did they appear before?
Joseph.
They appeared before Joseph. Joseph, of course, recognized who they were, told them, you know, in what we understand as one of those great acts of forgiveness, told them that what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And you know the story well. R.C. Sproul tells this story, or he actually puts these things together just to prove a point here. He says, if there had been no coat, there probably wouldn't have been so much jealousy among Joseph's brothers. No jealousy, no selling Joseph to the Midianite traders, no selling of Joseph to the Midianite traders, and Joseph would have never gone to Egypt. No Egypt, no selling to Potiphar. No Potiphar, no encounter with Potiphar's wife. No Potiphar's wife, no prison. No prison, no meeting with the butler and the baker. No meeting with the butler and the baker. No meeting with Pharaoh to interpret his dream. No meeting with Pharaoh, and Joseph never would have become prime minister. If Joseph had never become prime minister, the Jews never would have settled in the land of Goshen. No settlement in the land of Goshen, there never would have been an enslavement of the Jewish people in Egypt. No slavery, no need for the rescue of a crying baby in a wicker basket named Moses. No Moses, no Exodus, no law, no real knowledge of sin, no real knowledge of sin, no need for a Redeemer, no need for a Redeemer, no Jesus Christ, no Christianity, no hope for mankind, no hope for mankind, no hope for you or for me.
Wow.
Amen.
All because of a colored coat.
And it all started with a coat.
A colored.
The multicolored coat in a nutshell.
Exactly. You know, I mean, it's a fascinating way to look at God's providence. God provides even in ways that we don't understand how or what He's doing. He provides.
Well, you take that so far back. I mean, it was
of course.
It was Rebecca meeting Abraham's servant. That was providence.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be standing here at noon reading
I
all
know,
this.
seriously, for all day.
But really, I mean, that's fascinating to consider. That sort of thing. I mean, we just look at our present situation and we bemoan the fact that God has us where He has us sometimes. we need to revel in the fact that God is using the events of our lives to bring us much more blessing in the future, if we're indeed His.
God works in mysterious ways.
He works in mysterious ways. That's right. We cannot understand how He works. God's providence is always intended to bring out what's best for His children. So anyway, we turn our attention now to Christology. Christology, which is the study of the doctrine of Christ. And the first thing we want to tackle here is the pre-existence and eternality of Christ. We know that Christ